Ah, got it. All right.
Yeah, what was interesting was this lecture, as you can tell, is almost 80 minutes long, so I encourage you to find it and check it out yourself. But one of the things about it was the whole lecture was built around a metaphor grounded in his culture. So what he was doing was taking a type of landscape architecture that he associates with what's happening in China and around the world mainstream as women with bound feet. So for people like me, I had to look that up. I don't know anything about that. We don't buy feet, right? But it's a deeply ingrained cultural practice, right? Because the aesthetic and beauty of women in particular are associated somehow with the size of and metaphor, a high performance landscape, and a new aesthetic with unbound feet, right? Fleet of foot. So in terms of meaning, the readings that you all did today, you'll find all came from the West. All came from places that for a lot of us in the room are very familiar, references, connotations. But one of the reasons why you have to kind of read the stuff, you got to think about it and try and apply it to your own situation, is not everybody shares your same cultural values. Not everybody has the same worldview. So, for example, I taught a class in Ghana, West Africa this summer. We spent some time at a friend, Dr. Kofi. Sorry, everybody's at Kofi. His farm, all right? So if I went up to his farm and just walked around on the farm and say, hey, that's a great farm, beautiful, smells great, looks great, wouldn't know a thing. He was there, though, as the storyteller and to talk about his cultural significance. So we were experiencing the same place, but in his head, because of his cultural background, his history, his connection to the land, he's able to weave it into stories, to talk about medicinal purposes, which are a very big part of that part of the world's view of plants and nature, its role in the spirit world, with gods, and ancestors, and a lot of different things. That richness is what meaning is about. So we had 3 primary meetings. There was one big one, 2 primary ones that had very different takes on meaning. Before we jump into it, were there any questions or any interesting pieces that you found from the background? Anything disturbing? There's one person in particular that said something that was disturbing to me. But I'll give it up to you guys first. Nothing? Everything was as clear as mud. Well, let's introduce our major.
I'm sorry, I missed something. Was there something to do before we came here today? Was there?
Was there? Reading.
Oh, okay.
I'll give the 10-minute summary of the readings. I encourage you to read them. So in the syllabus, every week, there are readings assigned that will be covered in that particular class.
Oh, I thought it was.
And all those readings,
okay.
and all those readings are in class stories. So
Okay.
everybody clear on that? Okay. All right. So we start with meaning. Why we start with meaning? Because it's something that requires a lot of reflection. We may come back to this at the end of this semester. I hope you revisit it through your whole career. I think that we make a lot of meaningless things. And I think that a lot of people don't think what we do as a profession is valuable. And I think that if we were more strategic about how we made things and invested in the meaning, then other people would see that meaning and they would see it as more valuable. But here's the takes, all right? So J.B. Jackson is one of my heroes. Right? Not a landscape architect, but taught landscape studies at Harvard for decades. Edited an excellent journal called Landscape. Very influential to the whole family tree of landscape historians that are tied to cultural anthropology, applied anthropology techniques to reading landscapes. His book, A Sense of Time, A Sense of Place, is pretty much should be in your library at some time, but we'll talk a bit about that because there's a brief read about him. 2 bullet points about him, the idea of what's called a thick description. Thick description. You all in the studio are working on site analysis right now. when you read a sense of place and a sense of time, and you read his description of New Mexico, like a Mexican landscape, he gets into so many things that usually in the constraints of a design project, we don't have time to get into that kind of depth. Right? But to know that using different professionals or looking at the place through different eyes can reveal different kinds of information. Particularly when you're trying to figure out what does a place mean, because you're going to be working on places all over the world. In certain cases, you may never even get to the actual site that you're designing. You need to find some tools and some strategies for gathering that information. He offers those. He spends a lot of time on ritual, right? So a lot of anthropologists spend a lot of time on that. And time, it takes time for places to build meaning, right? You can't stamp meaning on site and expect people to conform to what you think that site means. In his mind, it takes years. In his case, thousands of years. A sense of time that's not even at the human scale. But a great author. Loyola, probably our most decorated and celebrated living landscape architect in the United States. Founder of Olin Partnership, although he's just stepped down, so he's not technically a part of Olin anymore. But his writing on form and meaning is really more of a historical piece, saying that really in terms of landscape architecture and in design, we're always in this realm between art and nature and history. Right? So there are cultural norms that give boundaries to how far we can explore. But every generation and every cycle, we sort of regenerate, reinterpret, remake tried and true and tested patterns. And he references a lot of significant historical landscapes you should be aware of and go through. As well as at that time when he wrote that article, some avant-garde ones that were challenging some of the boundaries, some successful, some not so much. But he spends a lot of time on vocabulary. So Virginia Jackson is coming in from an anthropology point of view to landscape architecture. Loyola is coming from literature. Right? That you can read a landscape. That there is a language, a syntax, a pattern. As long as you follow the rules of the language, then you have a well-designed and meaningful landscape. Mark Trout. Probably the premier critic in landscape architecture. He's actually trained as an architect. It was written extensively, particularly about the modernist landscape, so the post-World War II landscape. So if you're a fan of that era of landscape architecture, mid-20th century, he's the guy. But in his case, he asked the real question, was like, why should landscapes mean anything? Why can't they just be gardens for pleasure? Maybe we're overthinking it. And then he kind of backtracks on it and says, well, wait a minute. They do mean stuff, but maybe there are different ways of pursuing meaning. And he outlines a few what we call typologies or types. But finishes with the necessity of pleasure. It's not a pleasurable experience, no matter how much brain power went into that design, no matter how much good it's doing for the environment, it won't be the damn thing. Right? Got to be able to do it.
I mean, at the end of this article, we started talking about these gardening magazines and how maybe that's the direction. It seemed like that's the direction you should go, simplifying everything to just individual sets of pleasure, a flower or a smell, or rather than these. We talked about Myers Lindbergh too, like how it's over the head of a lot of users, or that should explain a project, or doesn't make sense for the designer to have to explain the project or leave notes to explain the project,
right?
Which we kind of go against that here, or finding people meanings in spaces and things of that nature.
Yeah. Okay. So what Eric is saying, I think, is right on the money in terms of at landscape architecture. Even our first presentation talked about it operating at different scales, right? So we're one of the few professions where it's very hard to evaluate a landscape by one object. You have to kind of think about where it is and how it relates to things, how people use it. Mark is saying, well, maybe not. Maybe it is about that little thing, doing the little things, right? I think it's up for debate. That is the point, though, that I was going to come to at the end, which is there are lots of things I find pleasurable that are horrible, that are completely meaningless. I won't share some of them in front of you because some of them are not fit for public discussion, but pleasure is like a very difficult thing, especially in an era where there's so much pain. All right, so let's get started. That's a good point. We'll revisit that. I think the big issue, and a lot of this theory, and some of this is sort of 20th century stuff, but in the 21st century is that we're so mobile as people. So a big idea of meaning, informing meaning, is the time that you invest in a place, which is J.B. Jackson's point. Right? So if you look at pre-industrial civilizations all over the world, some civilizations 10,000 years old. That's a long time to get to know that landscape. That's a long time to build rituals from birth to marriage to rites of passage to working in the army or becoming a farmer. It's like a period of time that we just have no sense of. One thing that typifies our generation is we're very mobile. Half the people in this class from another country. So do those old rules even apply? Is the fact that we are so mobile really the dominant thing? Should we really rethink the whole thing? There's an interesting quote from a geographer here, which I think is pretty easy to digest, and will frame the rest of this piece. Writing about a body of knowledge called place attachment. Like, how do people get connected to places? So here asks, what happens to the people's emotional bonds with place in a highly mobile society? Later on,